There is a room backstage, 3 meters by 4, no larger than a prison cell, and it smells of grease paint and whiskey. The year is 1967. Beyond the door, 1,000 voices roar with laughter, wave after wave crashing against the thin walls like surf against a breakwater. But here, in the stillness, the funniest man in Britain is not laughing. He stands before the mirror, 6'4", hands the size of dinner plates, a red fez perched on his head at a faintly absurd angle. Those hands, the same hands that, moments ago, reduced an entire auditorium to helpless, weeping, gasping hysterics, are trembling. In his right, a tumbler of scotch, half empty or half full, depending on whether you are an optimist or have met him personally. In his left, a folded slip of paper. A woman's handwriting. Neat, slanting, careful, not his wife's. He reads it again, then sets it down on the dressing table beside the grease paint and the trick deck and stares at his own reflection as though expecting it to explain something. It does not. Reflections never do. This is not the story you think it is. You have heard, perhaps, that a comedian died on stage. That is true as far as it goes, but it does not go nearly far enough. Because Tommy Cooper did not simply die on stage on the 15th of April, 1984. He had been dying on stage for 40 years. Every evening, every botched trick, every magnificent failure. And the only place where he truly lived was behind the curtain, in the dim space between two women, 2 bottles, and 2 versions of himself that could never be reconciled. To understand how he arrived at this moment, the dressing room, the whiskey, the note, you must go back. Back past the television cameras and the roaring theatres, past the army camps and the African desert, all the way to a small Welsh town that smelt of coal dust and rain, where a boy called Thomas Frederick Cooper first discovered that if you made people laugh, they stopped looking too closely. But first, one detail. He never destroyed that note. And months later, Gwen found it, tucked into the breast pocket of his good suit, the one he wore for television recordings. She did not scream. She did not confront him. She unfolded it, read it, folded it again, and placed it back exactly where she had found it. Then she closed the wardrobe door and went downstairs to make his tea. She never mentioned it, not once, not ever. And Tommy never knew she had seen it, or if he did, he never said so, which in this household amounted to the same thing. We shall come back to that wardrobe. But first, Wales. The house at number 19, Llywelyn Street, Caerphilly, was not theirs. The Coopers rented it, 2 rooms in a terraced row, pressed between identical neighbours like books on a shelf, in the county of Glamorgan, in the south of Wales. It was here on the 19th of March, 1921, that Gertrude Catherine Cooper, known to everyone as Hilda, gave birth to her first son. There was no doctor present. There was no midwife. The landlady of the house delivered the child, because that was what you did when you could not afford anything better. They named him Thomas Frederick. He weighed, by all accounts, a considerable amount. He would never stop being considerable. His father, Thomas Henry Cooper, was a miner. Not by choice, no one chose the mines, but by the grim arithmetic of South Wales, where the only reliable employer was the earth itself, and the earth took its payment in crushed spines, blackened lungs, and early grave. Remember the date of the boy's birth, the 19th of March, 1921. Now hold another date in your mind, the 15th of April of that same year, less than a month later. On that day, the Triple Alliance of British trade unions collapsed. The railwaymen and the transport workers withdrew their support for the miners at the final hour. They called it Black Friday. The infant Thomas Frederick lay in his cot, not yet a month old, on the day his father's world fell apart. 63 years later, on that very same date, the 15th of April, his own world would end, on a stage in London, before 1,000 laughing strangers. Dates are only numbers in a calendar, but sometimes the calendar reads like a script, written by someone with a very dark sense of humor. By 1924, Thomas Henry had seen enough. Enough cave-ins, enough coughing, enough funerals for men who were 35 but looked 70. He packed his family, Hilda, little Thomas, and the baby, David, and moved them out of Wales entirely, southwest to Exeter in Devon, where the air was clean and the ground did not try to kill you. Thomas Frederick was 3 years old. He would never live in Wales again. Later, when journalists asked about his roots, he would deflect with a grin. "My father's Welsh, my mother's from Devon," he would say. "I left Caerphilly when I was a year old, had a love affair with a girl that went wrong." The audience would laugh. They always laughed. And the truth that a small boy had been uprooted from everything he knew, deposited in a strange English city where his accent marked him as foreign, would vanish behind the punchline, as it always did. It was in Exeter, at the age of 8, that the transformation began. His aunt gave him a magic set for Christmas, a cheap thing, cardboard and string, the sort of toy that most children would discard by Boxing Day. Thomas did not discard it. He practiced every evening, fingers fumbling with cards and coins and cups. And one day, performing for a handful of school friends, everything went wrong at once and they laughed. Not politely, not cruelly, but with genuine, helpless, uncontrollable delight. They laughed at the failure. He stood there, surrounded by that sound, and understood something that most performers spend a lifetime learning. Success is forgettable. Failure is fascinating. An audience will applaud a trick done well and forget it by morning. But a trick done spectacularly badly, they will remember for years. He was 8. He had found his life's work. He did not yet know that 55 years later, his final failure would cost him his life, and the audience would be laughing then, too. His character was forming in ways that would define the man as much as the performer. The poverty of those early years, the rented house, the miner's wages, left a mark that no amount of later success would erase. Biographer John Fisher would eventually call him the meanest man in show business. And while there was affection in the phrase, there was also accuracy. Picture this. Cooper, by now famous, wealthy, climbs into a London taxi. At the destination, he pays the fare. Exactly the fare, not a penny more. Then he leans towards the driver, presses something into his breast pocket, and says, with that enormous, unreadable grin, "Have a drink on me, mate." The driver reaches into his pocket. It is a tea bag. The driver does not know whether to laugh or swear. Cooper walks away, perfectly serious. The war found him as it found every young man of his generation. He enlisted in the Royal Horse Guards, was attached to the 7th Armoured Division, the famed Desert Rats, and shipped to Egypt. He began performing in naffy clubs, the canteens where soldiers ate, drank, and tried to forget what was happening outside. His act was rudimentary, a few card tricks, some patter. The tricks went wrong. The soldiers howled. A sergeant, watching from the back of the room, turned to the man beside him. "I don't know what he's doing, but whatever it is, don't make him stop." Whether those early failures were deliberate is debated. Even his Wikipedia entry flags the claim with a cautious citation needed. but the effect was undeniable. Comedy in wartime is not escapism, it is defiance. It was in Cairo that the Fez arrived. The details are disputed. There are at least 3 versions, and Cooper himself told a different one each time. The most common account: he was performing and needed a hat for a trick. He borrowed one from a passing waiter, a red fez, the traditional headwear of Egyptian service staff. He put it on. The audience erupted. He never took it off. For the next 40 years, the fez was as much a part of Tommy Cooper as his hands, his grin, and his voice. The army gave him 2 gifts. The first was the discipline of performance, the understanding that an audience, any audience, deserves your best, even if your best looks like your worst. The second was the habit of drink. Soldiering and drinking were in the 40s virtually synonymous. A tot before battle, a bottle after, a glass for the lads who did not come back. It seemed harmless at the time. Most things that destroy you do. His brother David, younger and quieter, never pursued the spotlight. He opened a magic shop, a modest enterprise, selling tricks to amateurs, a life lived in the margins of the world his brother dominated. David's daughter, Sabrina, would later inherit the business. In 2022, Sabrina Cooper was murdered in Eastbourne, a crime reported in the press and noted with grim brevity in several biographical entries. Tommy felled on stage in '84. His son Thomas, dead at 32 in '88. His niece Sabrina, taken by violence in 2022. 3 generations, 3 sudden deaths. Not a curse, there is no such thing, but a weight of sorrow that presses down on a family name better known for laughter. From Egypt, the young guardsman returned with a fez, a thirst for scotch, and the conviction that on stage he was untouchable. All that remained was to find a woman willing to share a life with a man who gave everything to an audience and brought home whatever was left. Gwendoline Henty was a farmer's daughter who had strayed into variety theatre the way people sometimes stray into rivers, gradually, then all at once. She was pretty, composed, practical, and possessed of a patience that would, over 37 years, be tested beyond anything she could have imagined. The wedding took place on the 24th of February, 1947, in Nicosia, Cyprus. A military ceremony, modest to the point of austerity. The bride wore borrowed white. The groom wore his uniform and a grin that, in the photographs, looks equal parts joy and terror. They returned to London. Their first home was a rented flat, small enough that the trick equipment took up more space than the furniture. Cooper played clubs, pubs, variety halls anywhere that would have him. Gwen was behind him, pressing costumes, checking props, keeping the books. Their flat was so cramped that the rabbit used in one of his stage illusions lived in the bathtub. One pictures the scene. A young couple, exhausted after a late show, wanting nothing more than a hot bath, confronted by a large white rabbit with no intention of moving. Gwen knew every trick in his repertoire. She could time the punchlines, anticipate the pauses, predict the reaction before the audience itself knew it was going to react. She knew him better than any spectator ever could, and that, in the fullness of time, would become the problem. Their son, Thomas Henty Cooper, was born on the 19th of January, 1956. He would grow up to become an actor, living permanently in the long shadow of his father's fame. He died suddenly in 1988, at the age of 32, from complications following liver failure, though some contemporary newspaper reports at the time spoke of a road accident. Their daughter, Victoria, Vicky, would take a different path. Not performance, but preservation. The children grew up in a household that was unusual by any measure. Their father was on television. Their father was on stage. What their father was not with any great frequency was at home. Picture small Vicky, cross-legged before the television set, watching her father make the nation roar. At the kitchen table behind her, his chair stands empty. She laughs along with the audience. She has learnt the timing like her mother. She has not yet learnt what it costs. Victoria would one day tell journalists, "My father was not a monster." The fact that she felt compelled to say it tells you more than any accusation. By the early 1960s, Cooper was no longer playing pubs. He was on the BBC. He was headlining ITV specials. Cooper, just like that, drew audiences of 15 million. His signature routine, the bottle and glass trick, became so famous that people who had never set foot in a theatre could describe it from memory. A bottle and a glass, each refusing to stay where they were put, defying gravity and reason, while Cooper stared at them in helpless bewilderment. The fez was recognized in every living room in the country. For Gwen, this meant a larger house and a new species of solitude. She was no longer the wife of a struggling performer. She was the wife of a national institution. Consider the difference. A struggling performer needs you. A national institution needs an audience, and an audience is a more demanding companion than any spouse. By the mid-60s, the drinking had shifted from habit to need. Scotch before the show, Scotch after. Scotch in the gaps between. Fisher describes flashes of temper, sudden, disproportionate, followed by equally sudden remorse. Flowers, apologies, promises. The cycle will be familiar to anyone who has lived near addiction. Tension, eruption, contrition, calm. Then tension again. Gwen absorbed it. She did not telephone friends to complain. She maintained an exterior of perfect composure. Whether this was strength or suppression, courage or captivity, only Gwen could have answered, and Gwen never answered questions about her private life. Not once. Not to anyone. By 1967, that composure had been stretched so thin you could see daylight through it. And it was precisely at this moment that another woman stepped into the gap, a woman who saw Tommy Cooper not as a husband with bad habits, but as a great artist who needed someone to believe in him. Her name was Mary Fieldhouse. The world would come to know her as Mary Kay, a name borrowed from her husband, the composer Norman Kay. She had a son called Tony. She had a career in the machinery of show business, costumes, props, logistics, the invisible labor that makes the visible spectacle possible. She was not a starlet. She was not a groupie. She was a professional, embedded in the same backstage world that Gwen had once inhabited, and then, gradually, been pushed out of as her husband's fame grew and the domestic sphere swallowed her whole. Mary was, in every functional sense, what Gwen had been in the early years, the woman behind the man, the hands that pressed the costume, the eyes that checked the prop list, the voice that said you were wonderful at the end of the night. The difference was novelty. Gwen had been doing this for 20 years. She knew every trick, every flaw, every evasion. Mary saw Cooper fresh. She saw the performer, the giant, the genius, the way an audience sees him, with wonder intact. And for a man who lived on wonder the way other men live on oxygen, this was irresistible. Their affair began in 1967. This date is consistent across multiple sources. Mary's own testimony in her 1986 memoir, interviews given by her son Tony to the Mirror and the Express, and the comprehensive biography by John Fisher. It would last 17 years, ending only with Cooper's death. 6,200 days of parallel existence, 2 addresses, 2 telephone numbers, 2 elaborately maintained architectures of deception. The mechanics were straightforward, as the mechanics of long affairs tend to be. Mary traveled with Cooper on tour, officially as part of his production team, which she was. Unofficially, she was his companion, his confidant, his second wife in everything but law. She cooked for him. She laundered his shirts. She waited in hotel rooms while he performed, and she was there when he came off stage, sweat-soaked and electric, needing someone to tell him he was extraordinary. Gwen, meanwhile, remained at home. She knew. Wives in such situations almost always know, through the accumulated evidence of small inconsistencies, unexplained absences, the telephone calls that end abruptly when you enter the room. She chose not to speak. Not ignorance, that would have been impossible, but a deliberate, considered refusal to acknowledge aloud what she could plainly see. For Gwen Cooper, this was the only weapon available to a woman who had decided that keeping the marriage intact was worth the price. Why did she stay? Love, perhaps. Financial dependence, possibly. The social norms of the era, almost certainly, for in the 60s and 70s, divorce carried a stigma difficult to appreciate from the vantage of the 21st century. Or perhaps something simpler, the farmer's daughter's determination to outlast the weather, however foul. Mary waited too. She waited for him to leave Gwen. He promised he would, the way men in his position always promise, with sincerity in the moment and evasion in the morning. One imagines the conversation. Late at night, another anonymous hotel room, the residue of room service on the tray. Tom, are you ever going to leave her? He would not meet her eyes. I can't, the children. The children are in their 20s, Tom. A pause. He reaches for the bottle. She understands. There will be no answer. Not tonight, not ever, because choosing was the one trick he could never master, the one failure that was not rehearsed. A crucial point, often lost in the sensationalism. There were no other confirmed affairs. No string of chorus girls. Only Mary. One woman for 17 years. This was not serial philandering, but the paralysis of a man incapable of letting go of Gwen, of Mary, of anything that had ever belonged to him. The world of British variety was small, incestuous, and ruthlessly observant. Everyone knew about Mary, the stagehands, the producers, the fellow performers. Cooper's agent, Miff Ferry. It was an open secret, visible to everyone inside the circle, invisible to everyone outside it. 1,000 people kept a secret that was not, in any meaningful sense, a secret at all. And there was another question the sources never satisfactorily answer. Did Norman Kay, Mary's husband, know? 17 years is a long time to sustain an affair in any circumstances, but in the claustrophobic world of British entertainment, it strains credulity to imagine he noticed nothing. Norman left no public statement, gave no interviews, wrote no memoir. He is a gap in the narrative, a human being reduced to a question mark. Now we arrive at the most difficult passage in this story, the question of violence. Let us be precise about what is known, what is alleged, and what is denied. What is acknowledged by all parties is that Cooper had a temper, not the theatrical anger of a performer playing to the gallery, but a private, unpredictable fury that erupted without warning and subsided almost as quickly. leaving behind guilt, bewilderment, and extravagant apology. Fisher describes these episodes as childish tantrums, shouting, door slamming, objects hurled across rooms. This much is common ground. What follows is not. Tony Kaye has spoken publicly, in the Mirror in 2014, and in other interviews, about bruises on his mother's body, a specific incident in which Cooper allegedly threw her across a room, a pattern of physical intimidation lasting years. His testimony is detailed and consistent. Victoria Cooper has spoken with equal conviction in the opposite direction. Her statement to the Mirror, "My dad was not an alcoholic wife-beater." She does not deny the affair with Mary, she has never denied it, but she rejects the portrait of her father as a man who raised his hand against women. Two children, two versions, two sets of memories shaped by love, loyalty, and the particular distortions that come from growing up on different sides of the same locked door. We do not have police reports, medical records, or sworn testimony. We have the word of a son who says he saw bruises, and the word of a daughter who says her father was not that man. Both are credible. Both are partial. This narrative will not adjudicate. It is not a trial, and you are not a jury. What it can do is describe the two silences that followed whatever happened behind those doors, the quiet of Gwen's house, where nothing was discussed, and the quiet of Mary's flat, where everything was endured, and let you hear in those silences whatever you hear. What happened in those rooms died with the people who were in them. What remains are echoes, and every echo sounds different, depending on which wall you press your ear against. There were quieter aspects of Cooper's private life that deserve attention. His library, for instance. He amassed thousands of volumes on magic and illusion, a collection now preserved in 116 archive boxes at the Victoria and Albert Museum. He was, by the testimony of fellow magicians, one of the most technically knowledgeable illusionists of his generation. The audiences saw a lovable fool. His peers saw a scholar. The greatest deception he ever performed was the vanishing of his own intelligence, night after night, behind a facade of cheerful incompetence. Then there was the hypochondria. Wales Online, among other sources, notes that Cooper measured his blood pressure multiple times daily, carried a portable pharmacy, and consulted doctors about symptoms both real and imagined. The irony is almost too perfect. A man terrified of illness who smoked 2 packets of cigarettes a day and consumed enough scotch to preserve a small whale. He monitored his body with the vigilance of a man expecting betrayal, while doing everything in his power to ensure the betrayal would come. By the mid-70s, it came. The symptoms accumulated with the grim predictability of a medical textbook: swollen legs, shortness of breath, irregular heartbeat. He was 56, but carried the cardiovascular profile of a man 20 years older. 6'4", significantly overweight, a committed smoker, a prodigious drinker, and a man whose profession required him to stand under hot lights, generating adrenaline in quantities that would tax a healthy heart, let alone one already compromised. He knew he was failing. The hypochondria that had seemed comically incongruous, the giant with the blood pressure cuff, was no longer comic. The fear had become prophecy. One imagines a consultation, a doctor's surgery somewhere in London. "Mr. Cooper, you need to stop drinking." And Cooper, because the compulsion to turn everything into material was as involuntary as breathing. "Doctor, have you ever seen me sober?" Sober, I'm even worse." The doctor did not laugh. For once, neither did Cooper. On the 22nd of April, 1977, in Rome, he collapsed on stage. Not the theatrical collapse that audiences expected, a genuine fall. Heart attack. Not massive, not immediately fatal, but unequivocal. A warning shot. Picture the hospital room. White ceiling. The murmur of Italian beyond the door. For a man who had spent his entire adult life surrounded by noise, laughter, applause, the clatter of props, the quiet must have been deafening. For the first time in years, he was alone with his own heartbeat. And his heartbeat was telling him something he did not want to hear. The doctors were direct. Stop drinking, stop smoking, reduce the workload. Cooper nodded. He agreed. He flew home. He changed nothing. Why? The easy answer is addiction. The fuller answer is more complex. Without the nightly fix of an audience who was Tommy Cooper, a freelancer with no pension, no contract, no safety net. A man with 2 households and no income if he stopped. A man who, stripped of the fez and the footlights, was left alone with himself. And that was the one place he could not bear to be. 7 years. That was the distance between the first warning and the last. His career, meanwhile, was contracting. The late 70s and early 80s brought a new generation, alternative comedians, punk satirists, whose humor was political, confrontational, deliberately abrasive. Cooper's act belonged to an older tradition. The ratings held among the loyal audience that had grown up with him, but the producers and commissioners began to look elsewhere. Solo specials became guest appearances. The Palladium became the corporate function, the after-dinner engagement where aging performers are wheeled out like antique furniture, admired and gently patronized. For a man who had once commanded the nation's full attention, each step down the billing was a small humiliation, anesthetized with another glass. The financial pressure mounted. 2 households, agent's commission, medical bills, and through it all, the thrift that had been comic in prosperity became desperate in decline. Miff Ferry continued to book engagements. Some accounts portray him as a hard-nosed businessman pushing a sick man onto stages for profit. Others describe a loyal associate carrying out the wishes of a client who refused to retire. Cooper wanted to perform. Ferry gave him the means. The question of responsibility was never publicly settled. In the final months, winter of '83, early spring of '84, the deterioration became impossible to disguise. Cooper forgot his lines. Not the deliberate comic forgetfulness of the act, but genuine lapses, words vanishing mid-sentence, whole routines dissolving. Those close to him suspected transient ischemic attacks, miniature strokes, brief interruptions in the blood supply to the brain. Gwen saw it. She begged him to stop. One morning, standing in the kitchen doorway, watching him pour brandy into his coffee with shaking hands. "Tom, please, not today." He did not turn around. "It's just one, love." It was never just one. They both knew it. She closed the door quietly and went upstairs. He drank the coffee. The day continued. Mary saw it too. She pleaded with equal desperation and equal futility. Neither woman could compete with the pull of the stage, the only place where his failures were triumphs, the only place where the chaos inside him transformed into joy. There is a quotation attributed to Cooper in his final weeks, reported by Wales Online, its original source unclear. "I know I'll die on stage. Just hope they get a laugh out of it. It may be genuine. It may be apocryphal, One of those remarks that attach themselves to famous lives after the fact, too neat to verify, too apt to discard. April 1984, the last month, a cold spring, and somewhere in an agent's diary, a booking for a show called Live from Her Majesty's, a variety program to be broadcast in real time on ITV on the evening of Monday the 15th. The 15th of April. There it is again. The date that first appeared in this story, 63 years earlier, on a day of betrayal in the Welsh coalfields. The date on which the Titanic sank in 1912. Dates mean nothing, of course. And yet, Her Majesty's Theatre stands on the south side of Haymarket, in the city of Westminster, a handsome Edwardian building with a Portland stone facade and the faintly self-satisfied air of a venue that has seen everything. Beerbohm Tree built it. Phantom of the Opera would later inhabit it. On the evening of the 15th of April, 1984, it was home to a live television broadcast called Live from Her Majesty's, produced by London Weekend Television for the ITV network, a variety show in the old tradition, transmitted directly into the living rooms of the nation with no delay, no safety net, and no second takes. The audience, approximately 1,000 people, filed in through the gilt and crimson foyer, found their seats, and settled into the expectant hum that precedes live entertainment. At home, several million more switched on their sets. It was a Monday evening. The promise of the program was simple. Familiar faces doing familiar things, the comforting ritual of British light entertainment at its most unapologetically traditional. Cooper was not the headline act. He was one of several performers on the bill, a guest slot, a few minutes of stage time, enough to remind the audience he existed and keep the booking enquiries coming. This was his career in '84, a name on a list, a segment between other segments. Backstage in the hours before transmission, the atmosphere was the usual controlled chaos of live television. Runners with clipboards, technicians testing microphones, producers speaking in urgent whispers about timings and camera angles. Somewhere in this machinery, Cooper prepared. The dressing room, one last time. The mirror, slightly spotted at the edges. The grease paint. The fez placed on his head with the automatic precision of 40 years' practice. The cloak, a large, enveloping garment central to the routine he had planned, a trick involving its transformation into a gown, the kind of simple visual gag that had always been his strength and that required, tonight, a physical dexterity his body might or might not be willing to provide. His legs were swollen, so badly, according to backstage accounts, that his shoes would not fit properly and had to be forced on over the inflammation. His breathing was labored. His color was poor. He was, by any reasonable medical assessment, a man who should have been in bed or in hospital or anywhere other than a stage. He asked, it is said, to postpone the engagement. A live broadcast, however, is not a restaurant reservation. There are cameras, crews, satellite links, contractual obligations. The machinery of television does not pause for one man's swollen ankles. Whether he was refused outright or simply failed to insist, the result was the same. On the evening of the 15th of April, 1984, Thomas Frederick Cooper put on his fez, picked up his props, and walked out of a dressing room for the last time. Somewhere in London, Gwen knew he was performing. Somewhere, perhaps nearby, perhaps backstage, Mary knew too. Two women in different rooms, carrying different versions of the same anxiety, watching the same clock. The red light came on. The cameras rolled. Cooper's segment arrived. He walked on stage. The audience greeted him with warmth reserved for an old friend, not hysterical adulation, but the deep, affectionate recognition of a face that had been part of their lives for as long as most could remember. He acknowledged them with the familiar grin, the familiar tilt of the fez, the familiar raising of those enormous hands. And then he began. The routine was vintage Cooper. The cloak was supposed to become a gown, and the transformation was supposed to go wrong, and the wrongness was supposed to be funny. He fumbled with the fabric. He mugged at the audience. He produced lines polished over decades of repetition, each word placed with a watchmaker's precision, each pause calibrated to the millisecond. The audience responded. Of course they responded. And then something changed. It was not sudden. That is the detail everyone who watches the footage notices, and nobody quite knows how to describe. There was no dramatic clutching of the chest, no cry of pain, no cinematic collapse. Instead, a gradual alteration, a slowing, a softening, a dimming. Cooper began to lean backwards. His timing, flawless seconds earlier, slipped. His words blurred. He sagged, slowly, as though the bones inside him were quietly dissolving. He sat down, or rather, he subsided, into a seated position at the rear of the stage. His body folded in on itself with the awful, unhurried inevitability of a building whose foundations have finally given way. Not a crash, a settling, a surrender. The audience laughed. That sentence requires its own space, because it contains the entire tragedy, not just of this moment, but of Cooper's life. 1,000 people watched a man in the process of dying and laughed, because laughter was what they had come for. Laughter was what this man had always given them, and laughter was the only response their experience had taught them to produce in his presence. He fell, and they laughed, because he had always fallen, and it had always been funny, and they had no framework, no precedent, no vocabulary, for the possibility that this time the fall was real. At home, the millions watching saw the same thing and reached the same conclusion. Some would later report an uneasy feeling, a flicker of doubt immediately suppressed by the reassurance of context. This was Tommy Cooper. Things went wrong. That was the act. In the production gallery, the cramped, monitor-filled room from which the broadcast was directed, the response was different. David Bell, the director, was watching on screens that showed what the theatre audience could not see. The angle of the body, the quality of stillness that no performance can convincingly replicate. Bell knew. He gave the order. Cut to commercial. The screen went dark. The laughter faltered, then faded, as the stage manager's voice cut through the auditorium. Behind the curtain, stagehands converged on the fallen man. Someone loosened his collar. Someone checked for a pulse. An ambulance was called. Paramedics arrived, the timeline measured in minutes. Though minutes, in such circumstances, feel like geography rather than time. Attempts at resuscitation were made. They failed. The medical cause was recorded as a massive myocardial infarction, a heart attack of sufficient severity to be, in practical terms, instantaneous and irreversible. The heart that had beaten for 63 years, through the coal dust of Caerphilly and the sands of Egypt, through backstage corridors and the bedrooms of two women who loved him and could not save him, simply stopped. Thomas Frederick Cooper, born the 19th of March, 1921, died the 15th of April, 1984, aged 63. Something ought to be said about the people in that auditorium. The 1,000 ordinary theatre-goers who bought tickets for an evening's entertainment and received a front-row seat at a death. They are, in most accounts, treated as a collective, the audience, a faceless mass whose response is invoked as the final punchline. But they were not a mass. They were husbands and wives, parents and children, couples on dates, pensioners treating themselves to a Monday evening at the theatre. They had come to be entertained, and they had been entertained, and then they had learned that the man who entertained them had been dying while they watched. Each of them carried that knowledge home. Each of them lay awake, replaying the moment, wondering whether there was a precise second at which they should have known. There was not. That is both the consolation and the horror. Cooper had spent his career perfecting the art of making real disasters look deliberate. In the end, the perfection of the art destroyed any possibility of recognition. The footage exists. It has been broadcast, excerpted, uploaded, and viewed by numbers that defy counting. You can watch Tommy Cooper die. It is available to anyone with an internet connection. Should you? The arguments circle endlessly. He was a public performer who died in a public space during a live broadcast. Against this, he was a human being who did not consent to his death becoming spectacle. This narrative will not tell you whether to watch. It will only observe that he gave everything to the audience. In the end, the audience received the one thing he had left. Now picture London, late on a Monday evening, 2 telephones ringing in 2 different rooms. Gwen learned first, or so the conventional account suggests. A telephone call, the voice on the other end delivering words that no arrangement of syllables can soften. She went to the hospital. She was the wife. She had the right, the legal right, the social right, the right conferred by a certificate dated the 24th of February 1947. Her grief was sanctioned, her presence expected. Mary learned how. If she was backstage, she may have known before Gwen, may have been among the first to see him fall, the first to understand the fall was final. If she was elsewhere, she learned from a television screen or a telephone or a knock on the door, the same way the rest of the country learned. One imagines her at a hospital reception desk, if she went, and we do not know that she did. Are you a relative? And Mary, because there is no word in the English language for what she was, not wife, not girlfriend, not partner, none of these terms capturing 17 years of shared meals and shared beds and shared lies. Number I know. 3 words. 17 years compressed into 3 syllables, and a pause that contained everything the syllables could not. Whether or not that exchange took place, and it is offered here as emotional truth, not documented fact, the underlying reality is beyond dispute. Mary had no legal standing, no right to be at the bedside, no claim on the estate, the memory, or the mourning. She was, in the eyes of the law, nobody, a woman who had devoted nearly 2 decades to a man who, in death as in life, belonged to someone else. The cremation took place at Mortlake Crematorium in southwest London. A dignified, well-attended affair. The great and the good of British entertainment gathered. The eulogies were warm. Gwen sat in the front row, upright, composed, wordless. The same qualities she had maintained throughout 37 years of marriage, deployed one final time. Whether Mary was present is unknown. If she came, she stood among mourners who knew her secret and said nothing, one last performance of collective discretion. If she stayed away, she mourned alone, in a flat that still held traces of the man she had shared. Either way, she was excluded from the rituals that society provides for the legitimately bereaved. There was no condolence card addressed to Mary, no hand on her shoulder. Her loss was real. Its acknowledgement was not. The newspapers ran their obituaries. The nation mourned with affection, anecdote, and the warm, uncomplicated sadness reserved for public figures who brought joy. Tommy Cooper became what he had always been on stage, a simple man, a funny man, a man in a red hat who made you laugh. The complications, the two women, the drinking, the rages were tidied away, and the public was left with the clean, bright image of a genius who died doing what he loved. It was a good story. It was not the whole story. The man who had spent his life hiding behind a performance was hidden, one final time, behind a legend. The ashes were dispersed. The dressing room was cleared. The props packed away. And the story, which should have ended with the closing of a curtain, was only beginning, because 2 years later, a woman who had been voiceless for 17 years picked up a pen and refused to be voiceless any longer. In 1986, 2 years after Mortlake, a book appeared in the shops. Its title was For the Love of Tommy. Its author was Mary Kay. The book told everything. The 17 years, the hotel rooms, the meals she had cooked, the shirts she had pressed, the promises she had believed. The waiting, endless, corrosive for a man who swore he would leave his wife and never did. The love which was real. The loneliness which was equally real. And the ending, which was not an ending but an amputation, sudden, complete, performed without anesthetic on the evening of the 15th of April. Why did she write it? Money, certainly. Cooper had left her nothing, no provision, no acknowledgement, no financial recognition of 17 years. Her position after his death was indistinguishable from that of a stranger. The book was, among other things, an invoice, but money alone does not explain the ferocity. There was also existence itself, having lived for 17 years as a shadow, a secret, a footnote the official narrative refused to include, and then discovering that the narrative intended to keep refusing. The obituaries did not mention her. The tributes did not mention her. The retrospectives erased her as thoroughly as if she had never been. The book was less a confession than a declaration. I was here. I mattered. You cannot pretend otherwise. And perhaps a third motivation, harder to name. Not revenge against Cooper, he was beyond reach, but against the world that had conspired to keep her invisible. The friends who had smiled at her across restaurant tables and then excluded her from the funeral. By publishing, Mary broke the unwritten code. And the code, once broken, could not be reassembled. The reaction was immediate. Gwen said nothing. This requires emphasis because it is perhaps the most remarkable element of the entire aftermath. Confronted with a published, detailed, widely reviewed account of her husband's 17-year affair, Gwen Cooper maintained the composure she had practiced for nearly 4 decades. No statement, no rebuttal, no tearful interview, nothing. She had survived the affair itself without public comment. She would survive its revelation the same way. One imagines a journalist, persistent, well-meaning, dialing Gwen's number. Mrs. Cooper, do you have anything to say about the book? No. But surely you must feel. No. The line goes dead. The dial tone hums. And the wordlessness, as always with Gwen, speaks louder than anything the journalist could have printed. The entertainment industry reacted with the particular outrage that communities reserve for those who violate unwritten laws. The content of Mary's revelations was not surprising. Everyone had known for years. What was unforgivable was the act of speaking aloud. Mary had broken the compact, and in doing so had threatened the architecture of mutual discretion that held the community together. She was not forgiven. The book sold. It was reviewed. It generated headlines and the brief, intense flare of public interest that attaches to revelations about beloved figures. And then, as such things do, it receded, absorbed into the background noise of celebrity biography, overtaken by newer scandals, fresher betrayals. Mary had said her piece. The world had listened briefly and moved on. She did not, as far as the public record shows, give further extensive interviews or seek additional publicity. She had spoken once, comprehensively, and then returned to the obscurity from which she had emerged, an obscurity that now felt less like strategy than like exhaustion. She had told her truth. It had not set her free. It had merely confirmed what she had suspected for years, that the world was not especially interested in her truth, and that the role of the other woman, in public sympathy as in private life, is to remain unseen. For 28 years after the book, the competing versions of Cooper's private life coexisted in uneasy truce. Mary's account on one side, the family's composure on the other, the public cheerfully ignoring both in favor of the uncomplicated legend. The truce held because nobody had sufficient motivation to break it. And then, in 2014, ITV broke it. The drama was called Not Like That, Like This, a title borrowed from one of Cooper's own catchphrases, a choice the family found particularly cruel. David Tennant played the lead. The production was ambitious, well-funded, and extensively researched. It depicted the affair. It depicted the drinking. And it depicted scenes of domestic violence, Cooper striking, Cooper intimidating, with the unflinching directness that prestige television permits. Victoria Cooper watched. And then, for the first time in 30 years, Victoria Cooper spoke. Her intervention, published in the Mirror, was not the carefully worded statement of a public relations professional. It was the raw, anguished protest of a daughter. My dad was not an alcoholic wife-beater. The words are blunt, unqualified, delivered without hedging. She did not deny the affair, she had never denied it. She did not deny the drinking was too well documented to contest. What she denied, absolutely, was the violence, the physical abuse, the image of her father as a man who used his size against women. That, she insisted, was fabrication. She said something else, less quoted but equally revealing. My mother never complained, never said a word against him. If he had been what they say, do you think she would have stayed? It is the logic of a daughter, not of a courtroom. It does not account for the 1,000 reasons women stay in difficult marriages: fear, habit, dependence, love, the terror of the alternative. But it is sincere, and it carries the force of first-hand experience, and it is, in its way, as unshakable as Tony Kaye's counter-testimony. Tony responded. Speaking to the same newspapers, he offered his own account, equally specific, equally uncompromising. He had seen bruises on his mother. He had witnessed aftermath. He had carried these memories for decades, watching the public celebrate the man who, in Tony's account, had brutalized the woman he loved most. He was not prepared to retract because a daughter who had lived in a different house, with a different mother, behind a different door, told him what he had seen was not real. 2 children, 2 truths, 2 houses, 2 mothers, two sets of evidence gathered from opposite sides of the same man. Victoria defending the father she had known, the man who came home, however infrequently, to a house where she felt safe. Tony defending the mother he had watched suffer, the woman who waited behind a different door for a man who brought tenderness and terror in unpredictable measure. Each was telling the truth as they had experienced it. Each was constitutionally unable to accept the other's version. They were not arguing about facts. They were arguing about which reality was more real, and that is an argument that can never be resolved, because reality, for those who live inside it, is not negotiable. The drama aired. Victoria's protests did not prevent it. Millions watched David Tennant inhabit the body of a man dead for 30 years and formed their own opinions and changed the channel and went to bed. Critics praised the production. The family condemned it. It was, in the end, what biographical dramas always are, an interpretation, not a verdict. A story told by people who were not there, based on accounts from people who were, filtered through the requirements of narrative structure and commercial television scheduling. Not the truth. A truth, one of several, competing and irreconcilable. The years after the drama brought no reconciliation. Victoria returned to her privacy. Tony returned to his. The war of memories continued underground, surfacing in anniversary articles and retrospective documentaries, never resolved, because resolution would require one side to concede that their experience was less valid, and neither side could make that concession. Neither side should have to. The participants in this story did not, on the whole, enjoy long or fortunate lives after its central figure departed. Gwen Cooper died in 2002. She was elderly. She was private. She died as she had lived, without public comment, without interview, without revelation. No memoir, no documentary appearance. The composure she had chosen in 1967 she maintained for 35 years, unbroken to the end. It was, depending on your temperament, either the most dignified or the most heartbreaking thing about her. Mary Fieldhouse receded from public view after the book. Her subsequent life is largely undocumented. She had spoken. She had not been heard in the way she hoped. She returned to the obscurity from which Cooper had briefly, incompletely, rescued her. Thomas Henty Cooper, their son, died suddenly on the 13th of August, 1988, 4 years after his father, at the age of 32. The cause, recorded on official documents, was complications following liver failure, though some contemporary newspaper reports at the time mentioned a road accident. He had been an actor. He had lived in his father's shadow. The shadow outlasted him. Victoria survived. She is, as of this writing, the last direct voice of the Cooper household, the last person who can say, "I was there," and be believed on the strength of first-hand experience. Her intervention in 2014 was reluctant. She spoke because the alternative was watching a televised version of her father beat a woman and saying nothing. Having spoken, she withdrew. The pattern holds. And then there was Sabrina. Sabrina Cooper, daughter of David, Tommy's niece, the woman who kept the magic shop alive, a modest retail space stocked with trick decks and linking rings and top hats with false bottoms. In December 2022, Sabrina was murdered in Eastbourne. The crime was reported in The Guardian, the BBC, and the Argus. The details belong to court records rather than to this narrative, but the fact belongs here because it completes a pattern no one in the family asked for and no one can explain. Tommy, dead on stage in '84. Thomas, gone at 32 in '88. Sabrina, taken in 2022. 3 deaths across 4 decades, each sudden, each premature. It is not a curse. Curses do not exist. It is simply what happened, a sequence of losses, each devastating on its own terms, forming a weight of grief that sits upon the Cooper name like a stone upon a grave. And yet, because this is a story about a comedian, and because comedians insist on the last word, the legacy is not grief. Not primarily. Open a browser. Type the name. Within seconds, you are watching him, the enormous man in the ridiculous hat, fumbling with a deck of cards, staring at the camera with an expression of such bewildered innocence that you cannot help yourself. You laugh. You laugh the way audiences laughed in '64, in '71, in '83. You laugh because the comedy is not topical, not dependent on context or era. It is pure. A man tries to do something simple. He fails. Does not understand why. He tries again. He fails again. And somewhere in the gap between intention and failure, something transcends, something not quite joy and not quite sorrow, but some compound of both, unique to this performer, impossible to replicate. His clips accumulate millions of views. The comments beneath them are written by people not born when he died, teenagers, citizens of a world Cooper could not have imagined, laughing at gags that were old before their parents were young. Just like that, his signature phrase, delivered with a flick of the wrist, circulates as a reference recognized even by those who could not name its author. The BBC, in periodic surveys, consistently places him among the greatest comedians Britain has produced. The Magic Circle honors his technical mastery. Fellow performers cite him as an influence, an inspiration, an unreachable standard. His comedy has outlived every shift in fashion and taste because it belongs to no fashion and no taste. It belongs to something older, the ancient, universal, irreducible pleasure of watching a fellow human being struggle with an uncooperative world. And in Caerphilly, the small Welsh town he left at the age of 3, a bronze statue stands in the centre, unveiled on the 23rd of February, 2008. It depicts a man in a fez, arms slightly raised, face frozen in an expression simultaneously comic and melancholy, as though the sculptor understood something the subject spent his life concealing. Townspeople pass it daily. Tourists photograph it. Children climb its base. It stands in the rain, and it rains often in Caerphilly, and the bronze does not corrode, does not age, does not drink, does not lie, does not grieve. It is the perfected version of Tommy Cooper, stripped of everything that made him human, left with everything that made him loved. Bronze is a forgiving medium. It preserves the pose but not the pain. It shows the hands, those magnificent, impossible hands, but not what they held. The whiskey glass, the prop that refused to cooperate, the folded note in a woman's handwriting. It shows the man the audience saw. It does not show the man the audience never knew. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all a statue, or a legacy, or a memory can reasonably be expected to do. To preserve the best, to let the rest recede, to offer to those who pass by on a wet Welsh afternoon a momentary smile and a half-remembered catchphrase, and to ask nothing in return but the recognition that once, in this town, a boy was born who would grow up to make the world laugh, and that the laughter, whatever its cost, was real. The dressing room is the same, 3 meters by 4. The mirror is the same, slightly spotted at the edges. The smell is the same, grease-paint and whiskey, the twin perfumes of a life spent performing and a life spent hiding. But the year is 1984 now, and the whiskey on the dressing table is untouched, and the man before the glass is no longer the man who stood here 17 years ago with a folded note in his trembling hand. He is larger. He is grayer. The lines around his eyes have deepened into permanent channels, carved by laughter that belonged to other people and worry that belonged only to him. The fez sits on the table, tilted at the familiar, absurd angle. The cloak hangs on the hook behind the door, waiting for the trick that will never be completed. He stands before the mirror one last time, and the reflection holds them all. The 8-year-old boy in Exeter, fingers too large for the coin trick, discovering that failure could be funnier than success. The young guardsman in Cairo, borrowing a waiter's fez and hearing soldiers laugh because tomorrow might not come. The bridegroom in Nicosia, nervous in borrowed white, promising a life he could not keep. The new father, pacing outside a hospital room in 56, enormous hands useless for the first time in his life. The husband who sat at his own kitchen table like a guest, loved, but not quite known. The lover who lay in another woman's bed and stared at the ceiling and could not choose. The comedian who walked on stage each evening and set fire to his own dignity for the pleasure of strangers, and who understood in some deep and unexaminable place that the fire was the only thing keeping him warm. The note is there too in the reflection. Not literally, it was lost long ago, or destroyed, or buried in the chaos of a double life's accumulated paperwork. But its ghost persists. The neat, slanting handwriting. The words he read and reread in this room in 67, the words Gwen found in the pocket of his good suit and never mentioned. That small folded slip of paper was the first visible crack in a mask he had been wearing since childhood. Through that crack everything else poured. The second household, the second telephone number, the 17 years of elaborate, exhausting, soul-corroding pretense. It was the moment the performance slipped, and he spent the rest of his life trying to put it right, and he never did. He reaches for the fez. The hands that once commanded 1,000 people are heavy now, the fingers slow. He places it on his head. The angle is automatic, 40 years of muscle memory, reliable even when the muscles themselves are failing. The heart that carried him through deserts and dressing rooms and double deceptions is stuttering towards its final rhythm. He can feel it. He has felt it for months, the irregular flutter behind his ribs, the tightness that arrives without warning and departs without explanation, the breathlessness that turns a flight of stairs into an expedition. He knows what it means. He has always known, in the way that hypochondriacs know, not through diagnosis but through dread, the chronic, low-level certainty that the body will betray you, that the machine will stop, that one evening the trick will fail and there will be no second take. Tonight there will be no second take. This is live television. The cameras are real. The audience is real. The heart attack, when it comes, will be real. But he does not know this yet, or perhaps he does, in the way that animals know weather, sensing the change in pressure before the storm arrives. Perhaps he has known for weeks, and the knowledge has settled into his bones like damp, and he has chosen to walk on stage regardless, because the alternative, retirement, obscurity, the long grey corridor of a life without applause, is more frightening than death. Perhaps that quotation, the one nobody can quite source, was not a joke at all. I know I'll die on stage. just hope they get a laugh out of it. Perhaps it was a statement of intent. He checks himself in the mirror. The fez is straight. The cloak is ready. The face looking back at him is 63 years old and looks older, pouched, heavy, the color of old paper. But when he smiles, something happens. The years fall away. The face transforms. It becomes, for an instant, the face the audience knows. The beautiful, foolish, incandescent face of a man who has never understood why the world does not work the way it should, and who finds this baffling rather than tragic, and who invites you to find it baffling too, and who, in that shared bafflement, creates a space where laughter is the only rational response. He holds the smile. He holds it the way a diver holds his breath, consciously, deliberately, against the pull of everything beneath the surface. Then he turns from the mirror, opens the door, and walks towards the light. The corridor is narrow. He can hear the audience beyond the curtain, the murmur, the rustle, the collective breathing of 1,000 people waiting to be delighted. He has heard this sound 10,000 times. It has never failed to terrify him, and it has never failed to save him. The terror and the salvation are the same thing. They have always been the same thing. That is the secret no one tells you about performance. You do not conquer the fear. You walk into it night after night, and it carries you, and you call the carrying by another name. You call it art. He reaches the wings. The stage manager nods. The floor manager counts down on his fingers. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. He walks on. The light hits him. 1,000 faces turn. The laughter begins before he has said a word. It always does. It always has, because the face alone is enough. The fez alone is enough. The sheer improbable bulk of the man is enough. He is funny the way mountains are large. It is not something he does. It is something he is. For 6 minutes he does what he has always done. He makes disaster look deliberate. He makes pain look like play. He makes the end look like another beginning. The cloak tangles. The trick misfires. He stares at the audience with an expression of such monumental bewilderment that they cannot breathe for laughing. Every gesture is precise. Every stumble is choreographed. Every failure is a triumph of timing so exquisite that only a handful of people in the world, his peers, the magicians and comedians who have studied him the way scholars study scripture, can see the craftsmanship beneath the chaos. And then, the body speaks. Not the performer's body, the trained, disciplined, obedient instrument that has served him for 4 decades, but the other body, the real one, the one made of aging muscle and narrowing arteries, and a heart that has been running on borrowed time since Rome in 77. That body has had enough. It does not consult him. It does not wait for a convenient moment. It simply stops cooperating, the way a machine stops when the fuel runs out, not with a bang, but with a gradual, irreversible winding down. He leans. He slows. He sags. The timing slips. The words blur. And then he folds, slowly, gracefully, with a gentleness that looks, to 1,000 trained eyes, exactly like the next gag in the sequence. He settles into a seated position at the rear of the stage, and the audience roars, because this is what he does. This is what he has always done, and they are doing what they have always done, and neither party knows that the contract between them, I pretend to fail, you pretend to believe, has just been fulfilled for the last time. The laughter is the last sound he hears. Whether it comforts him or not, we cannot know. Whether in the final seconds of consciousness, he recognizes the sound for what it is, 1,000 people loving him as they have always loved him, without knowing him as they have never known him, we cannot know. We know only that he gave them everything, and that they took it, and that neither side could have done otherwise. The curtain falls. The lights change. Backstage, hands reach for him. David Bell in the gallery cuts to black. The ambulance comes. The paramedics work. The heart does not restart. And in the stillness that follows, the particular weighted stillness that settles over a theatre when something has gone irreversibly wrong, the fez lies where it fell, on the boards of a stage that has seen a century of entrances and exits, and will see a century more, but will never again see anything quite like this. He is gone. The boy from Caerphilly, the soldier from Cairo, the husband, the father, the lover, the frightened, brilliant, impossible man who spent 63 years perfecting the art of public failure and never mastered the art of private life. He is gone, and the audience is still laughing, and the laughter will echo for decades, growing fainter but never quite fading, carried on the airwaves and the internet, and the memories of those who were there and those who wish they had been, until it becomes something larger than any single performance. A sound that belongs not to one man, but to everyone who has ever watched something go wrong and chosen to laugh rather than cry. Just like that.